The Flash, and by extension the Arrowverse as a whole, has now entered its final season and final 13 episodes, and since the Arrowverse is what this channel was originally built on, I decided to do something that I used to do up until around like the beginning of 2020 and review each episode of this final season before doing a review of the season as a whole and finally the entire show. This video is a review of The Flash Season 9 Episode 1, which is the 172nd episode of the show, titled Wednesday Ever After. This season apparently uses a newer and better camera, but it definitely uses a new cinematic aspect ratio, which definitely looks better. However, I feel like if they were going to switch to this, they should have done it a few seasons ago, back when the CW started to transition to this aspect ratio like with Batwoman, Stargirl, and Superman and Lois. I say this because it feels kinda weird. There are 8 seasons and 171 episodes of this show, followed by another 13 episodes and 1 season that has a completely different aspect ratio. Sure, it makes the show look more cinematic and generally better, but on a rewatch binge, I feel like there might be a bit of a disconnect between the first 8 seasons and the final one, but since they have switched, it will at the very least make these last 13 episodes look a bit better. I'm not complaining for this season in particular, but like the show as a whole, it's a bit weird to only transition now. The episode starts with a scene of Team Flash fighting Tar Pit. His CGI is a bit dodgy, but they carried over his design from, what was it, season 2 or 3? And the actual design is cool, but the scene is pretty terrible and immediately put a bad Eric Wallace-y taste in my mouth that took a little while to go away. Despite the new camera, the cinematic aspect ratio, and even the cool looking CGI monster, this scene looks super cheap and reminiscent of the last few episodes of Season 7, where all the speedsters teamed up, which in and of itself reminded me mostly of Power Rangers because of the awful cinematography. No aspect ratio or camera can make up for bad cinematography. Then there's also like awful writing, like Barry saying, "Welcome back, let's do this one last time." Like that line doesn't fit here at all and was a clear wink and nod to the audience that broke any suspension of disbelief. And yeah, I know it ended up being a dream, and some choices like including Frost were there particularly to make you question this reality, and it did, but that doesn't change the fact that I cringed in this scene and I thought the scene looked really bad. So it was an awful start to what ended up being a pretty okay episode. From there, the episode becomes a time loop situation, and I will say, all the build up towards time being looped was pretty well done, and in the minutes before the reveal, I was pretty engaged in what was happening. The time loop itself took a very different approach to the concept than I've personally seen before, as there was a lightness and a comedic element to it without any elements of horror or people going crazy. This was fun to watch, I laughed a few times, and it's engaging in its own right, but by the end I did feel a bit dissatisfied with their execution of the concept. Like when I realized they're doing a time loop concept, like the second it happened, I was excited to see these characters in a situation like this, and seeing them go through it, and while they do go through some trauma in regards to the time loop, it was almost entirely shown in a comedic or even romantic light, and yeah, it was fun, but not as interesting as the typical time loop concept, even the one they made in Season 5 of this show with Nora. Also, the way they explain this time loop and then how they get out of it makes no sense. The explanation is super unsatisfactory because it's all about Iris not doing a thing she's supposed to do in the future, and then for some reason that causes her to enter a time loop, but also Barry enters that time loop until she does that thing, and then eventually at the end she does something similar enough to leave the time loop. That makes no sense. Knowing the future or coming from the future and doing something different in the past has always changed the future on this show, so why is it now all of a sudden causing a time loop? And then the way they get out of this time loop is so anticlimactic. It's basically just Iris saying that, alright, let's do this thing that's vaguely similar to what the future says I'm going to do, and then the next scene is already the next day. It's an incredibly anticlimactic moment. The actual climax of this episode, however, is pretty good. Like, it's the whole nuke scene, which is a really cool display of the Flash's powers, but the climax of the time loop was incredibly anticlimactic. I enjoyed the episode and the story for what it was, but I thought it needed to be explained way better and thought it had the potential to be much more. Also, the lesson that Barry learns with his book in this episode falls completely flat because it doesn't feel believable that Barry would ever think something like this is okay, or any sane person would. You'd have to have zero emotional intelligence to not realize how something like this takes away anybody's free will and will take any joy or excitement out of a person's life. I get that he's gone through some stuff and Iris died or was foretold to die or got lost in an alternate universe or in time. It feels like 100 times at this point, but still, I can't see any sane individual feeling okay with a book that essentially takes away a person's free will and just knowing everything that will happen in your life, and then needing to go through a time loop, an argument with Iris, a lecture from Joe and Cecile, all before finally realizing it. It didn't really feel believable at all, and made Barry feel very unlikable, to the point where Iris, plus her characterization was really good in this episode, was far more likable just because she was a reasonable person in this episode compared to Barry. Also, it does not make any sense for the context of this show for Barry to think everything he's been told or learned or saw about the future will actually be the real future, since the future, like I said earlier, has changed multiple times over the course of this show. Iris is supposed to be dead, Barry is supposed to die in 2024, which is when the crisis is supposed to happen, Oliver is still supposed to be alive. None of those things happen because the future has changed. So this whole storyline, this whole part of the episode is bad, it falls completely flat and makes no sense. Everything outside of the book, Barry is still likable, but any scene with the book makes me really not like Barry in that scene. The new Captain Boomerang debuted in this episode, and regardless of how he ends up, I appreciate him appearing at all, since the Digger Harkness version of Captain Boomerang was more of a Arrow character, despite being a Flash villain in the comics. Owen Mercer's design is great, but for now, that's all the praise I have for him. He is working with Red Death, who appeared earlier in the season than I expected, and I'm getting some early season speedster villain vibes from Red Death in this one scene because of the vibrating and the voice and the working the background from the very beginning, but because of what we know about this character already, I doubt she will end up being as good a villain as some of the better villains in this show. This episode has 3 or 4 scenes of Eric Wallace bullshit that's plagued the show for years, things that are never good in any episode, scenes with Joe and Cecile where all nuance of emotion must go out the window because we have a character, that being Cecile, who can tell the audience every emotion that a character is feeling, so she tells the audience and tells Joe that he's feeling anxious. The scene where Chester and Allegra kiss, which has this big triumphant background music because there's all these seasons of build-up, and I could not care less. And then also the new Kate Frost is revealed, and she's just like Caitlin with purple streaks in her hair, and yet again, I couldn't care less about what's happening here. Recently, Eric Wallace said in an interview that he was going to make an episode all about who hacked Chester's computer, because apparently that's something that happened. I don't remember that at all, but that never ended up happening because the season got cut short from like 20-ish episodes to only 13. Hearing that, and the fact that Eric Wallace is disappointed by that, and nobody in the audience gives a shit, makes me think like, what the fuck, who let this person run this show? He's awful. And it gives me so much less faith in this show, but at least they cut down the episodes, and at least Eric is now being forced to only give us exactly what matters, and all of the fat, all of the filler is being trimmed out, or at least some of it, so that's a positive. In conclusion, the final season of The Flash is off to a middling start. It's not unexpected, but it is disappointing because of Arrow's final season, which started off way better and ended up being pretty good. I'd give this episode a 5 out of 10, which might sound really bad, but this is based off of a score system where 5 is the absolute average, and not where 5 is awful for some reason in most score systems. That doesn't really make much sense, but yeah, a 5 out of 10, so it's the most middling you can get, the most middle of the road possible episode of The Flash, and that's not what you want for the final 13 episodes.